Hi, I'm Chris O'Falt, VP of Features at IndieWire and host of the Filmmaker Toolkit podcast, where we talk to our favorite filmmakers about the craft and process behind their latest work. But today we're going to do something different, and in fact, it's something that we're going to be doing a lot more of this year as we build out the Toolkit platform. We're going to start looking at some of the issues, some of the challenges and opportunities facing filmmakers today. And today we're going to be asking the question, why is it that even some of the most successful indie filmmakers are having trouble making a living? By any measure, the 2025 Oscars that were just coming off were a triumph for independent film. Our friend Sean Baker, with his film Nora, won 5 Oscars. Brady, Corbet with The Brutalist, 10 nominations in a film that was heralded. But something very interesting happened as Brady and Sean were out front in the awards race. And we heard them talk while under the Oscar spotlight in a way that we're not used to filmmakers talking. They spoke very honestly about the challenges that they have faced in their career and continue to face.
If you are a writer-director trying to break in right now, there's a good chance you're making a film for free or making next to nothing on production or sale. How do you support yourself with little or no income for 3 years?
This isn't about Sean and Brady. They're great artists. They're going to continue to be great artists. But it does highlight something, which is where Brady and Sean are right now is where all independent filmmakers want to be. They got $6 and $10 million respectively for a budget to make 2 films that were completely uncompromised and wholly of their vision. And then they put them out in the world and they were embraced. Awards films, critics, and audiences are starting to see them. Meanwhile, they're also working with 2 distributors that everybody wants to work with, Neon and A24, right? So this is like what? This is what everybody wants, right? So why is it that they're up here and they're talking this way? What does this mean for independent filmmakers? We have the perfect guest with us today to talk about this, producer Alex Sachs, who's produced 24 films and has worked with a number of independent filmmakers, including with Sean on his previous 2 films, The Florida Project and Red Rocket, but also other films that we've talked about here on the podcast, Thoroughbreds and Paul Dano's Wildlife. And so, Alex, thank you for joining us.
Yeah, you're so welcome. I'm happy to be here.
So, Alex, I said beyond your IMDb page and your incredible credits as a producer, one of the reasons I think that you're the exact person I want to talk to about this is your unique career arc and how you got into this, because a lot of this came from getting an incredible education in financing of indies, right?
Yeah, that's right. That's right. Before I started producing about 9 years ago, I was a film finance agent at ICM for 4 years. And that was really where I learned how to raise money, how to structure financing, all while understanding how those movies would ultimately sell and what the distribution landscape was, because one sort of begets the other. In understanding what the value of the movie is in the marketplace, you can reverse engineer what the budget should be and how much money you need to raise and so on and so forth. And before that, I had worked for, the reason I sort of knew to get into the finance department was because I worked for a producer named Brian Kavanaugh-Jones, who had done the same thing at CAA for years. And I sort of saw him as a young producer who had just left the agency. It's kind of an oracle because he was able to identify material, sure, which is what a producer is doing, but then also raise money and talk to financiers and make them comfortable and really guide the sort of nuts and bolts process of getting the film into production.
And a lot of filmmakers I've noticed at Sundance, not universally, but a lot of it does start with their agency, right? And finding that
Absolutely.
That idea of with being ICM and the fact that that's often where that step forward.
That's
right?
absolutely right. It's most on any given year, and there's always ones that kind of come out of nowhere. People, filmmakers that aren't yet repped, that really are coming out of left field. But for the most part, the slates of films at Sundance or South by or Cannes, et cetera, are movies that were packaged and financed through the finance groups at the agencies or companies like Cinetic and some others. But yes, they have a huge place at these festivals every year, and then they sell all the movies.
So I think, and please, you're the expert here, but I think maybe the easiest place for us to start with is kind of a 101
Sure.
on equity investing, because there's no 100%, but
Right.
that's kind of how a lot of these type of projects that go to a Sundance and that maybe have a star attached or a director on the rise, they're often these equity investments, right?
Yeah. It's also, it is by and large the majority of how movies at some of these festivals are getting financed, especially on the smaller side. So equity investors or equity investments, what it really means is cash. It really means somebody wires your budget, or according to a cash flow schedule, parts of your budget alongside a schedule based on how often you need the money. And it's pretty much the simplest form of film finance. So if I'm making a movie and I need $5 million, an equity investor, if I'm lucky, it's only one. They are responsible for the entire investment. And then what that usually means on the backside in terms of what happens in success on the film, the model is typically, and everybody does it a little bit differently, but the investor would get a 20% premium on that $5 million. That's their, they recoup plus their premium. And then after that, sometimes there's off the tops, your sales agent takes a gross fee off the film. There might be some overhead. And again, this would all be pre-negotiated before you go make the movie with them. But after that, then usually the creative side, which is the filmmakers, the actors, etc., own half of the movie, 50% of the movie, and the investors keep the other half of the movie. And that is like the simplest, easiest model to make an independent film.
Let's talk about this concept of first money. So if I understand this correctly, the sale was for 7.
Yep.
So there's going to be a couple things taken off there, the sales agent's
Yes.
fees, maybe a couple finishing things. So maybe that money is a little bit lower.
It is,
And then the first money out is the investor recoups $5 million.
Mm-hmm.
And then if there's still money left, they're going to recoup their additional 20%.
That's correct.
So what remains? So let's say we got down to, we'll forget about the money off the top. What remains of what's left of this very healthy sale is now then split evenly between the creator side and the investor side, right?
Yeah, and I will say, for math purposes, I understand not wanting to do verbally right now the percentages and all of it, but I do think it's worth noting that on a $5 million budget, it's likely that a sales agent is taking a 10% fee. So on that $7 million sale, that's $700,000. So you're talking about, then you're at $6.3 million. Let's forget that there are any other off the tops. The investor has to recoup $5 million plus a 20% premium. That's $6 million. So 6.3 minus $6 million. The filmmakers and the investors are lucky if there's $300,000 left. And then to your point, that splits 50-50.
So in this case, which I think for like an IndieWire reader, this film sold for $7 million at Sundance. Really what is remaining here is the $300,000 is now going to be split evenly.
That's right.
After the waterfall of the first money out.
That's right.
Which, as you start doing this, you start to realize how the difficulty.
Yeah, and a $7 million sale is a robust one these days. I mean, it depends on the size and scope of the movie, but every festival we're having sort of less and less of these anomaly-esque huge sales. There was a period where we were having a lot at every festival, which was really exciting, and that's tapered quite a bit.
Right. So, and obviously it's going to vary from filmmaker to filmmaker, but in that $5 million budget, the director does have their directing fee, right?
Absolutely. Absolutely.
But that really is, and I don't know if you want to give a ballpark here, but that really is their pay while they're making the film.
That's
right?
That's correct. And that, look, again, depending on what they need to accomplish on a $5 million budget, could be anywhere from $75,000 to a few $100,000. A few $100,000, that would really be somebody who has probably made a bunch of movies. They're going to do this smaller thing, and maybe they could command that fee. Otherwise, you're probably in low six figures. And then who knows how long the movie took to get put together. And then, of course, the process of making and posting the movie, is really a solid year of intense sort of day-to-day work.
Because even just to get to the point that someone like you is out bringing this to a potential financier, we're talking about incredible amount of work on the creator's part, right?
Absolutely.
And then all of the prep. That money, and most filmmakers, they might not be Sean and actually edit the film themselves, but they're in the editing bay.
Absolutely.
Often seeing it through. So you're often talking about what can be a 3-year process.
Absolutely.
In which a lot of that they're not getting paid. So that even if it is low six figures, that is for 3 years of intense work of trying to make this film.
Yeah, and look, it completely varies because I'm sure there are plenty of people who would say it took me 8 years to get my movie made. Or then, you have a film, an anomaly film like Thoroughbreds, which from the play getting turned into a screenplay to Sundance was 10 months.
Right.
So there's a range.
He had made a name for himself as a writer. So
Yeah.
It could be.
Absolutely.
Now, before we start digging into more specifics, it's not like anybody has ever recommended getting into independent film to make big bucks. Do you know what I mean? Like, I don't want to pretend that Jim Jarmusch was like swimming in cash or something like this.
Right.
But I am hoping just to zoom out for a little bit. Things have become more acute, though, in the last few years in terms of this math that we're talking about, right? Things have shifted to being even more difficult for the filmmaker in recent years, correct?
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. Look, I think it's all a fixture of what has happened to the sales market. It's just really challenging for investors to recoup, and thus getting the movies made has become harder. The budgets have to be tighter, which means there's less for people to get paid up front, but then also where we started, the sales market is pretty bad. So if you don't make the movie initially with A24 or Neon or Focus or Searchlight, then you're hoping on one of a couple anomaly sales at a festival, and that's, not probable.
One thing, because I covered this a little bit about 6-7 years ago, obviously so much of the industry has moved towards SVOD, these subscription services, Prime, Netflix, Hulu. One thing that was happening, and we'll stick with Sundance, that was happening about 6-7 years ago was, from my understanding was, and this is before they started making them all themselves or gobbling them all. If Netflix couldn't buy something that they wanted at Sundance, these other distributors, an IFC, all the smaller ones that aren't affiliated with big studios, they would know, Netflix or Prime or whoever would make it known, we want this film.
Correct.
And you can go in and bid on this film knowing you're probably going to get $700,000 from us.
Correct. That's right.
For a streaming deal, which then changes your math when you're thinking about owning a film
advance.
For 10 years.
That's right.
Yeah.
That's exactly right.
So there was initially with streaming a little bit of those dollars propping up some of these sales, right?
Yeah.
But that has shifted because that doesn't exist anymore, right?
Here's the thing. It doesn't not exist entirely, and I will say this is not my day-to-day business anymore of selling films daily. However, from what I'm hearing is the companies that don't have puts with for SVOD, so, A24 having Max or Neon, I think is Hulu, the other distributors that are independent distributors, if they don't have those put deals, from what I'm hearing, it's become incredibly challenging for them to get an SVOD deal, to get those numbers, to your point, from Netflix, Amazon, Hulu, and thus they can't offer a substantial advance because they're relying on theatrical and transactional, and that only accounts for so much of the revenue on a film.
So I just want to make sure we didn't lose any listeners here.
Yeah.
Basically, A24 has an output deal with Max right now. They've had previous ones. So right now, when A24 has a movie and they're producing it, they're financing it, that movie will end up on Max. And I don't know what their contract is, but
Same.
there's a certain formula that they know
Sure.
that they can count on a certain amount of
That's
SVOD
right.
money, Neon with Hulu, and obviously Searchlight has the relationship through Disney with Hulu and whatnot. So there are those companies that can depend on it. But the companies that don't have that,
Yeah.
they're having a very hard time accessing both those platforms and those dollars.
That's right.
Obviously, there's always exceptions.
Yes,
There's
absolutely.
hot topic docs and things like that. But general, if that's where the viewership is going, if that's where our consumer dollars are going, and you can't get both that platform and to those dollars, the world gets smaller very quickly.
Yeah, it does. That's right. That's absolutely right.
That's the shift. That's scary. That's what scares me, is that these companies built themselves on the back of a lot of independent filmmakers are trying to do it, and now you constantly see that, and then it's if we didn't make it, if we didn't produce it, and it's not some big thing, there's no interest, and that scares me, because that's how people watch stuff.
That's why the sales market after every festival is as dour as it is. You're a month out of the festival and there's only been 4 sales. And that just didn't used to be the case, at least at that volume.
Right. One thing that also came up, and actually we had Sean at our Future of Filmmaking event, and he spoke about this, and he was saying that life got a little bit easier for him, I think, when he got like a good agent to handle his commercials careers. Sean doesn't want to go into television, but he could start, he had enough of a name, had enough of experience.
Yeah.
Advertisers would want him to come in and do certain campaigns or certain deals. And so he was able to make money like that.
Right.
I think that's always been true, in the sense that
Definitely.
commercials are always there to make a little money. But increasingly that is the case, right? Where you have to, if you're going to keep making films, you have to find other forms of making money, right?
Yeah, I do think, to stress it, I do think that's always been the case. But whether it's doing television directing, or it's teaching, or it's doing commercials, yes, I think it is almost completely impossible to make a living going from film to film at this point. Again, unless you're one of a top 20 director who's making huge fees on huge budgets of theirs, it's very challenging. And all of those things can be supplemented. And then some people do corporate video work. I mean, there's a million different versions, but yes, I think that's always been true, and it's only gotten more true, sadly.
Right, because I think the thing where, and we'll just use Sean as an example, we've followed his career. We've watched him grow.
Yeah.
We've watched him evolve as a filmmaker. And that's wonderful, and he's unique and he's special. But I think there's a thing here, which is that maybe what is the most rare is that he made 8 films this way, because that's almost, and I think that's what scares me a lot, is that the concept of even making 8 indies is, or consistently making these films, not that there was a ton of this, but I just worry that it's not even a sustainable thing to just keep doing it.
Well, no, I don't. I mean, I think it was his speech at the Indie Spirit Awards, where I think it was this one, where he said, I'm able to do this because I don't have kids. I don't have a family. And it's objectively not sustainable otherwise. He's done it, because of sheer passion and force of will, and probably because he can't possibly see himself doing anything else. But that is such a rarity on multiple levels. But it really, yes, I think it is a big point to how is this sustainable? And I think the answer that you're getting at is it's not.
Yeah, it's interesting. We were talking before. The Kelly Reichardt path of teaching And especially in universities where you
Yeah.
have like 3-4 month summers, and I see Eliza Hittman doing this, kind of following Kelly's.
Yeah.
That seems to be that idea that I can work towards. And also, I think there's something about being engaged with students and being engaged in the art form itself
Absolutely.
is probably fueling it. But you see more and more of that, of people going into academia and then using their summers to make their projects.
Yeah, yeah. And then I also think there's plenty of filmmakers who are writer directors, and they really lean into the writing side of the career. And that's what they're doing in between making movies. So there's a lot of different versions of it, but there's very few that can only work as an independent film director and make their living from that alone.
What about this idea that it's also becoming harder and harder to make these films in the U.S.? You know, Brady's film is a period film set in, by and large, rural Pennsylvania, and he shot it in Hungary. Now, he's made it clear there was advantages to shooting in Hungary.
Right.
Sean himself, there was some union issues here in New York, which wasn't that uncommon that that IATSE would flip a job, but nonetheless,
yeah,
there is this thing where I'm seeing more and more filmmakers making films in Ireland. Linklater and Jarmusch's next film are Ireland based. It's becoming harder and harder to do an American indie, right?
Yeah, that's right. That's right. Look, I think the strikes happened. Everyone, the cost of living in this country has gone up. It's more expensive. It's particularly more expensive in the production hubs. These are major cities. And so crews need to make a fair living wage. And again, same with directors, same with writers, same with actors, and that includes day players and background, et cetera. So unfortunately, the costs of making a movie, regardless of above the line, have just become much more significant than they were several years ago. And there's a lot of rules when it comes to the unions in terms of, once you're tier 1 and above with IATSE, there are minimum staffing requirements. There are things that, that your certain crew members in certain departments they have to do certain jobs. Other people can't take those jobs. It's the way the union protects its members, of course. But that can become really problematic for a film that only has a few $1 million. And so what a lot of people are doing is going to Eastern Europe where the crew labor is cheaper because they're getting more days, they're getting the time they need, they're just getting more value on screen than what they can get in the States because everyone's cost of living is higher. And so it's happening more and more. I haven't had to do that yet myself, but I guarantee it's only a matter of time.
It's rare, and that's a little bit of a unicorn, right? Like,
completely.
That's rare that you've been doing so many US-based things.
Completely.
And that idea, and maybe we can move this outside of indie film. Like, basically what happens, if I'm understanding this correctly, is that the unions, let's just say Roger Deakins likes to operate his own camera. He always does.
Yeah.
But for example, if an indie, like, the unions might look skewed at like, oh, you're not hiring a camera operator. You're idea that like
sometimes what will happen is, when a DP wants to operate for creative reasons, et cetera, they apply for a waiver. And sometimes the union grants it. Sometimes they don't. Sometimes they grant
usually
it and
track
say,
record, things like that,
And sometimes they grant
record.
it and say, that's fine, but you're still going to hire an operator. You're going to pay for an operator out of your budget because it's not fair that a worker is displaced because someone else on the crew wants to do 2 jobs. So it depends, but again, that impacts the budget. On a huge budget film, it's maybe less of a problem, but on a small film, it's really problematic.
I think what you're also seeing is, and I think independent filmmakers are always kind of problem solving this way, you are seeing people do multiple jobs out of necessity, right? Like, I mean, that's one of the ways that people taking on multiple roles.
We did Red Rocket non-union in Texas during COVID. That was the only time I've done low budget movies through my whole producing career, and as an agent. And the time period where the unions were least likely to flip anyone at any budget level was during COVID, because things were just so insane. And the intention with that film, part of why we made it during COVID, was because it was an idea that Sean had that he always wanted to make with a tiny, tiny, tiny crew. And so we've said this before, but Red Rocket, our crew was 6 people. And then the 4 producers, those 10 people did all of the jobs. I think if you look at the credits, I didn't do this, but some of my colleagues, I think if you look at Alex Coco, it's like first AD, it's several, like mine would have been Alex X producer, second AD, crafty, catering, occasionally props. Like it would have, we all had like 18 jobs, but we were allowed to do that because we weren't union. And so that worked, and that's how Sean wanted to make the movie. And it was also during this very strange time in, the summer of 2020, fall of 2020, where no one was working anyway.
Yeah, they weren't drawing lines. They wanted people shooting.
Yeah, I mean, no one even knew we were shooting. We didn't even know we were shooting. I mean, it was, crazy on a number of levels.
But that would be near impossible now, right?
Yeah.
Or would you just have to go not?
Look, it depends. If you're shooting a genre movie in one location in a state that does not have a strong film presence, yeah, you can probably do that just the same in the States, for sure. But it's harder. And by the way, I don't know, I haven't encountered this recently, so maybe people are finding that even that's not possible. It's definitely harder to do things. I mean, I have under $5 million movies that I would never imagine being able to do non-union today.
This is a hard question, and I can understand if you want to punt on it.
Yeah.
Because it's not uniform, but I feel like economics, filmmakers and creatives are always used to working within restrictions.
Yeah.
And working and thinking about this. Are we also seeing, are you getting more scripts? Are you getting more projects that are, we could go shoot that elsewhere? Do you know what I'm saying? In that sense of like, because I always think of the American indie has a very distinct sense of landscape, of place.
It's funny, I'm not. However, that's not usually what an agent or a manager would lead with in pitching. I actually think they'd expect me to read it and come to that conclusion myself. Of course, if something is set in Europe or on a beach somewhere, then some of those things are a little more obvious. It definitely comes up. I mean, everyone's aware of it, and anything that's easier to get made, people will use that as a selling point. But I haven't gotten an overwhelming influx of that.
I'll just say, and maybe it was on my mind.
Yeah.
This was the first Sundance I noticed it. And the few films that I saw at South by too, and again, that's a small sample size, but I was starting to see it,
I believe it. I was at neither, so I can't speak to the films that were there, but I've certainly heard of way more people shooting abroad.
Yeah. Okay. Now that we bummed everybody out, but I mean, obviously we're going through a period of contraction. And sometimes contraction can lead to, often changes, and those changes are often led by independent film. But I'm wondering, you're very good at making movies and helping movies get made. I'm not expecting you to predict the future here, but I mean, looking forward, is this something where when we think about contraction, that just means less of these type of films, or do you see some kind of change, the fact that something's got to give at some point, not that we know what's coming, but that something's going to change?
Look, I think sadly, the only reality I see is less of these films. And the reason why I really say that is because of what the distribution landscape looks like. I think people will always be making independent films. There will always be outside money that will finance these films. But their ability to break through, aside from the quality of the film itself, because it is a huge part of it, you need distribution. You need, and by the way, even when you get the best distribution, if there's too little that can be spent on marketing, and there isn't some sort of grassroots or organic campaign that the distributor didn't have to pay for, which almost never happens, it's the problem becomes, if these movies, the ones that are going into theaters, even the ones that are getting released now, if they all continue to make so little money, the distribution companies also start having a problem. I mean, it's systemic. And so I think less is what will happen, but mostly just because the companies may not be able to stay afloat. I mean, I do think people want to see these films, but we haven't quite figured out how much they want to see them in theaters versus on streaming. And I think there are factors that go into both, and we're all sort of navigating through this new normal post-COVID. I do still think people want to see movies in theaters, but the box office isn't robust enough yet that it's deeply convincing, and we're getting like windfalls of cash for these independent distributors to keep bulking up their releases.
Right. I think there is maybe a little bit of hope, though, in a new generation, in particular in cities that are going to the art house cinemas. You know, the story I always tell is I've been in New York for, I think, 23 years. And when I first started going to like Film Forum, I lowered the age by, by like, 80% of the average audience in there. And now when I go to Metrographs, and I double the age, it's
wow,
like, obviously
yeah.
I'm older, but I mean, there are places that are finding, because the boomers for so long, especially in the big cities, drove the art house. And obviously for a lot of reasons, they're getting older, COVID, streaming, they're no longer can be relied on. So I do start to see a little bit of hope that there is a younger generation of audience that's, especially in the cities, that's seeking these things out. Not that they're not seeking them out elsewhere, but they're supporting it.
And I think that's right. I don't work at Neon. I don't work at A24, so I don't have the access to the data and the information that they have. But no, I do think that's right. I think the question is it enough? Like, how long can we hold on for until there's some real explosion of attendance and participation that is meaningful and full enough that not only can we sustain what we have, but we can get more robust in our distribution of these kinds of films. Because I don't think no one wants it to contract further, but even staying where we are right now feels lesser than where we were 5-10 years ago, because it is.
Well, Alex, thank you for joining us. And I was asked, a lot of people knew you from your TikTok, and that is something you plan on bringing that back at some point?
I will be bringing it back sometime soon. I will be.
But for the meantime, you've got a little Alex Sachs producing fix here on Toolkit. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you, Chris.